The city hummed far below the penthouse, unaware it was about to lose a legend. Thorn Radcliffe stood alone with a glass of scotch, watching amber light fracture like a warning he refused to acknowledge. Somewhere in the silence, a security sensor failed to blink. A thread snapped in the vast web of systems he had trusted for decades. He did not reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. Men were crossing his perimeter, professionals, precise, confident they were hunting an aging king. What they didn't understand was that Thorn had already felt them coming. In the subtle shift of air, in the silence that leaned too hard against the walls, in the stillness that promised violence. This penthouse wasn't just a fortress. It was a memory palace of traps, passages, and rehearsed inevitability. As footsteps whispered closer and shadows moved where they shouldn't, Thorn finished his drink with deliberate calm. There was no fear in him, only recognition. This was the game he had mastered, now turned inward. Tonight wasn't about survival. It was about authorship. Because when men came to kill Thorn Radcliffe, they didn't understand one final truth. The legend had already decided how the story would end. If you're hooked, stay with me till the very end of the story. Don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I've got so many incredible stories coming your way, and you definitely don't want to miss any of them. Alright, let's get back to the story. The faint hum of the city below no longer held its usual comfort. Thorn's gaze lingered on the amber liquid in his glass, the light fracturing through it like a prism of warning signals he refused to name. The air in the penthouse shifted imperceptibly, subtle enough that anyone less attuned would have missed it. The faint flicker of a security monitor, a sensor that failed to blink, a thread pulled taut in the vast web of surveillance he had once trusted implicitly. He swirled the scotch lazily, letting it coat the edges of the crystal. There was no panic in his movements, only the practiced grace of a man who had seen every conceivable betrayal, every sudden turn in a game of death he had spent decades perfecting. The silence of the room pressed against him, and yet it was not oppressive. It was expectant, a stillness that promised the arrival of chaos. Thorn did not reach for his gun. The notion never crossed the threshold of thought. He did not need to. The weapon in his hand was patience, and it had carried him further than any barrel ever could. He leaned back, feeling the weight of leather and steel settle around him, and let his mind trace the familiar contours of the penthouse. Every hidden passage, every trapdoor, every shadowed corridor was catalogued in memory as precisely as the scars on his own hands. The silence broke first with a whisper, barely perceptible, the click of a mechanism that should not have moved. His eyes narrowed, tracing the subtle vibrations in the hardwood floor. Then another, softer, almost apologetic. The system he had built, meant to shield him from the unworthy, had faltered. The invisible boundary was breached. A ripple of satisfaction passed through him, not fear, not anger, but acknowledgement. This was the game he had always loved, now played against him. He took another sip, letting the warmth travel slowly down his throat, steadying him. The world outside his penthouse was irrelevant. The men who had stepped over that perimeter were still shadows, still abstractions, still guesses waiting to be confirmed. And yet, he knew precisely how they moved, how they thought, how they would react to his calm. His detachment, once a flaw in the eyes of men, was now his greatest advantage. The glass met the table with a soft clink, echoing faintly in the cavernous space. His eyes traced the room as though it were a chessboard, and each piece, a chair, a lamp, a painting, was a potential ally or weapon. Nothing in this place was new. Everything had been anticipated, catalogued, and then dismissed. And yet, now, the whisper of intrusion made the air electric, the room alive with possibility. He rose slowly, as if stretching after a long rest, and allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The men outside, unseen, would soon learn that the rules of engagement belonged entirely to him. He did not hurry, he did not panic, and he did not reach for a weapon. He merely finished his drink, savoring the last drop of clarity before the storm arrived. Because the game had begun, and Thorn Radcliffe was already 3 moves ahead. The soft scrape of boots against polished marble echoed faintly in the hallway outside. Thorn did not flinch. He had waited for this moment, felt it in the subtle changes in the air, in the way shadows moved without light. He could hear their precision, the way they stepped, paused, and listened, the whispered coordination between them. Every motion was deliberate, rehearsed, professional. They were men who had trained for this, who had been told that no one could stand in their way. And yet, the ghosts of every story, every whispered name of the man they hunted, trembled in their instincts before the door even opened. The first shadow slipped past the threshold, and Thorn's eyes tracked it without turning. The hitmen were cautious, scanning each corner, their weapons raised but not yet firing. There was reverence in their fear, a recognition of the predator waiting within the walls of his own fortress. They moved like hunters aware that the prey might already know their patterns, their weaknesses, their very heartbeat. One of them paused near the grand staircase, hand hovering over the trigger, eyes narrowing at a painting tilted just enough to obscure a hidden sensor. Thorn allowed himself a small, internal acknowledgement, well-trained, precise, predictable. They did not know that every painting, every fixture, every shadow was mapped in his mind. They did not know that he had already seen this moment unfold countless times in his own imagination, each potential outcome catalogued and discarded until only the inevitable remained. A whisper from the lead, Silas, floated through the hall, clipped and controlled. "Move," he ordered, his voice low, careful, betraying just the faintest tremor. The others obeyed, bodies tensed, rifles ready. Their professionalism was flawless. Their fear was subtle but unmistakable. Even men who had never known hesitation sensed the weight of Thorn Radcliffe's name pressing down on them. The hallway became a stage of calculated steps and measured breaths. Each footfall was a question, each pause a test. Thorn leaned against the far wall, silent, letting the shadows dance across him as if he were nothing more than part of the architecture. The hitmen passed closer, a mere arm's length away, yet none saw the glint in his eyes, the awareness that tracked every motion, every intention. One of the younger men exhaled quietly, betraying his tension. Thorn imagined the racing of hearts, the sweat collecting behind collars, the silent prayers that went unspoken. He allowed a fraction of a smile, unseen in the dim light. They were afraid, and they should be. Fear did not weaken them, yet, but it made them predictable, and predictability was a luxury Thorn had always exploited. Step by step, they advanced, shadows folding into shadows, until the hallways seemed like a living thing, breathing with intent and caution. And Thorn remained, a ghost in his own domain, the calm center in a storm that had already begun. He did not move, did not speak, and did not reveal that the hunt had already turned into a game of his design. The legend they sought to kill was already 3 moves ahead. The penthouse breathed around him, a labyrinth of steel and shadow that only he truly knew. Thorn moved without haste, gliding through the familiar corridors as if the building itself recognized him, whispering his name in the echoes of empty rooms. Behind every painting, under every rug, through every panel he had installed years ago, lay traps and passages designed to turn the hunted into the hunted. Tonight, those secrets awakened, and Thorn became the predator in a cage he had built with his own hands. A faint click from the dining room drew him toward the hidden panel beneath the wine cabinet. Without breaking stride, he pressed his thumb to a barely visible indentation. The floorboard slid open with a soft, mechanical sigh. He dropped into the shadowed passage, the faint smell of oil and dust welcoming him like an old friend. Above, the hitmen moved with quiet precision, their rifles sweeping the rooms, searching, calculating, but unaware that each step toward him was a step deeper into the web he had spun. He paused mid-passage, listening to the soft scrape of boots on marble and the low murmur of Silas issuing orders. Thorn's lips curved slightly. The men were skilled, yes, but even skill could not anticipate instinct honed over decades. Every hidden door, every trapdoor, every corridor had been designed with one thing in mind. Survival? Yes, but also control. He was still the composer of this symphony of shadows, the conductor whose hands guided every note of violence. A floor plate in the corridor ahead creaked under the weight of a foot. Thorn's fingers brushed it as he passed. A pin slipped, a wire released. Moments later, above him, a chandelier quivered violently, swinging with terrifying precision. A thud, a curse, and a man toppled from the staircase, clutching his arm. Thorn's passageway swallowed him once more, the faint thrill of satisfaction coursing through him. The hitman had entered a puzzle whose solution was death, or at least disorientation. He moved with the grace of a shadow, flowing through the hidden network of his own making. Narrow staircases, ventilation shafts, and concealed alcoves allowed him to flank, retreat, and reappear with a terrifying inevitability. The penthouse itself became his ally, the walls whispering directions, the floorboards hinting at footsteps, the air carrying the weight of impending consequence. To any outside observer, it would appear as though the building was alive, orchestrating violence with a mind of its own. Through a slit in a floor grate, he watched Silas's figure pacing, eyes darting, frustration mounting. The protégé's confidence began to crack, subtle but perceptible. Thorn noted it silently, allowing the moment to linger. He had trained these men, molded them, yet they had forgotten the first lesson: never underestimate the ghost in your own house. He slid silently from one passage to the next, feeling the pulse of the building beneath his feet, the thrill of the hunt mingling with the calm of inevitability. He was a predator in his own cage, and every shadow, every trap, every breath of the intruders only confirmed what he had always known. The predator still ruled here, and tonight, the prey would learn the cost of trespassing. A soft crash echoed from the hall below, followed by the sharp, instinctive curse of a man caught unaware. Thorn had been waiting, patient as always, allowing the sequence of his carefully laid traps to unfold with mechanical precision. The first hitman had stepped too confidently, following the rhythm of a predator unaware that another predator had already anticipated him. A chandelier had shifted, a floor plate had snapped, and gravity had done the rest. Thorn emerged from the shadows like smoke, silent and deliberate, his movement fluid, controlled. The hitman sprawled across the marble, clutching a shattered wrist and a bleeding temple, eyes wide in disbelief. The rifle slipped from his grasp, skittering across the floor, useless. For a moment, the intruder did not even realize what had happened, only the sudden, undeniable presence of death in a man-shaped form. Thorn leaned closer, letting the dim light of the chandelier swing across his face, revealing the faint creases of age but none of hesitation. The hitman's breathing was ragged, shallow, each exhale punctuated with the panic of the unprepared. There was no mercy in Thorn's eyes. There was only understanding, a lesson waiting to be delivered. "You expected a victim," he whispered, voice low, calm, almost intimate. The words carried more weight than any bullet, more sting than any blade. They were the truth that men like this seldom faced, that the world did not bend for arrogance or training. That assumption was a fatal flaw. The dying man tried to speak, perhaps to protest, perhaps to plead, but the sound caught in his throat, stifled by shock and the heavy, almost tangible inevitability surrounding Thorn. Thorn straightened, letting the first intruder collapse fully to the floor, surrendering to gravity and consequence. There was a rhythm to this violence, a cadence that his enemies could never hope to predict. Each step they took, each careful advance, only fed into the choreography he had memorized, rehearsed, and perfected in every detail of his life. Above, the hum of the city continued, oblivious to the carnage inside the penthouse. Thorn could almost hear the heartbeat of the building, steady and patient, a reflection of his own calculated calm. The other men would hear the fall, would hear the whispered lesson, and fear would creep in where arrogance had once lived. Silas, somewhere beyond the next corner, would know immediately that the rules had changed. The protégé who had come to test his old master would now understand that experience outweighed youth, anticipation outweighed speed, and knowledge outweighed force. Thorn's eyes swept the hall, sharp, unyielding, and the taste of inevitability lingered in the air. The first blood had been spilled, and with it, the first truth of the night had been etched into memory. In this dance of predator and prey, the lesson was clear: the hunted had never been a victim. A low rumble of movement passed through the walls, the faint scrape of boots and the whisper of rifles adjusted for sight. Thorn paused, leaning against the cold stone of a hidden alcove, listening. His breath was steady, measured, while the pulse of the penthouse hummed beneath his feet. Silas was close, too close, and Thorn could feel the weight of the man's decision hanging like smoke in the hallways between them. A voice, controlled and sharp, cut through the silence. "You taught me everything," Silas said, the words deliberately slow, almost ceremonial. "And yet, you left me nothing." There was no accusation, only a statement of fact, a justification spoken into the walls that separated predator from predator. Thorn smiled faintly, the gesture a ghost of warmth in the dim light. "Nothing," he whispered back, his voice traveling like a shadow, curling through the hidden passages. "I gave you everything you needed to survive. Knowledge, skill, discipline. Everything but the arrogance that would get you killed." Silas shifted, the sound of metal against marble soft but deliberate. "I needed more than survival. I needed a chance to carve my own name. Your empire, it suffocated me. Every lesson, every expectation, every restraint, it was a cage. And you were the lock." His voice carried frustration, and yet beneath it lingered something else. Respect, perhaps, for the man who had shaped him so thoroughly. Thorn considered the words carefully, letting them echo in the spaces between them. "You were never my equal," he said quietly. "And you never will be. Not because of skill, not because of fire, but because you cannot see the difference between a king and a pawn until it is too late. You believed betrayal would give you freedom. It gives you only consequences." There was a pause, a careful breathing that filled the gaps in the conversation. Silas had trained under him, fought beside him, and even admired him once. That admiration had twisted into envy, ambition, and ultimately, rebellion. Thorn had anticipated it. Not the moment, not the exact path, but the inevitability of disloyalty from one who had been molded to want more than his own limits allowed. "You could have walked away," Thorn continued, voice soft, measured. "No one would have stopped you. You chose this. And now, between walls, between shadows, you see what that choice costs." Silas exhaled slowly, a mixture of defiance and hesitation. "I made my choice because you never trusted me. You never let me lead. I am not a child anymore." "And yet," Thorn murmured, almost to himself, "you are still learning the lesson. Freedom is not given, Silas. It is earned. And sometimes, it is taken at a price you cannot afford to pay." The silence returned, heavier now, filled with the weight of expectation and inevitability. Thorn straightened, moving toward the corridor that would bring him back into the fray, the lesson already imprinted on the air. His protege had chosen his path, and Thorn, as always, was already 3 moves ahead. The lights died all at once. 1 second, the penthouse glimmered with warm amber and cold neon. The next, it was swallowed by a suffocating blackness that pressed against Thorn like a living thing. He did not flinch. Darkness was not new to him. It was nothing. Nothing to fear, nothing to lose, nothing to distract him. The rest of the world might panic, but he had long ago learned to see without seeing, to listen without hearing, to strike without looking. A rifle clicked in the distance. The sound was faint, almost polite, but enough for Thorn to register the rhythm of fear in its owner. He shifted silently, gliding across the polished floor with the precision of someone who knew every inch of this space. Shadows were no longer necessary. The walls, the furniture, the very floorboards were extensions of him now, guiding him like tendrils in the dark. Silas's voice, low and controlled, cut through the black. "Thorn, come out. This ends now." Thorn smiled at the sound. His protege thought he could summon him with words, and could draw him out like a cornered animal. But Thorn had learned that darkness was equal parts ally and weapon. Every step, Every shuffle, every whispered breath of the intruders was catalogued, analyzed, and countered before they even realized it mattered. A stumble, the scrape of a boot against marble. A curse, clipped and sharp. Thorn followed the faint vibrations through the floor, moving like water through the penthouse, flowing around obstacles, closing in on his prey. He had prepared for this, long before the first footsteps ever crossed the threshold. A chandelier hung loose above the main hall, a wire taut, ready. He released it with a subtle twist of the wrist, and it crashed into the floor with a deafening crack. A scream followed, echoing off walls and ceilings, cutting through the dark like a blade. Another hitman tried to flank him, moving silently along the balcony edge, relying on the absence of light as cover. Thorn felt the faint pressure of his presence, heard the almost imperceptible shift of weight, and struck. The man toppled into the shadows, his body meeting marble with a final, quiet thud. Even Silas, trained and confident, had begun to hesitate, each step uncertain, measured, deliberate. The advantage of sight was gone, replaced by instinct, reflex, and fear, and Thorn was already inside the minds of those who sought to kill him. He paused for a moment, listening to the chaos, the whispers, the panicked breathing. The darkness was complete, total, absolute, and in it, he moved like a wraith. Nothing could surprise him here. Nothing could unseat him. Nothing could make him flinch. And in that void, in the silence between screams, he realized the truth he had always known. When there is nothing to rely on but yourself, everything else becomes irrelevant. The fight had shifted. The rules had changed. And Thorn Radcliffe was the only man still in control. A faint, mechanical whir broke the rhythm of the penthouse. Thorn froze mid-step, eyes narrowing in the darkness. He had accounted for every movement, every footfall, every instinct of the men who had come to kill him. And yet, this was new. Something beyond training, beyond anticipation, had entered the game. A pulse of light flickered briefly from the far corner. A failsafe he had installed years ago, meant for emergencies, now triggered by some unknown weight or misstep. It illuminated a small cluster of shadows, giving just enough shape to the chaos for a heartbeat. A floor panel clicked into place with an audible snap, revealing a hidden compartment that had gone unnoticed. Thorn's mind raced, not with panic, but with calculation. Anything could happen now, and it had. Silas cursed somewhere in the black, his voice sharp with sudden uncertainty. Thorn could hear the hesitation creeping into the careful cadence of the intruder's movement. The unpredictability of this variable, this intrusion into the script he had memorized, was intoxicating. It reminded him that no matter how much one plans, life always contains an element of chance, a sliver of chaos that can bend even the most rigid design. He shifted silently toward the source, letting the shadows guide him, feeling the pulse of the building beneath his fingers. The penthouse itself seemed alive, responding to his touch, humming with latent energy he had forgotten existed. A hidden panel released a cascade of steel rods, one striking the floor with a sharp clang that sent another intruder sprawling. The faint smell of heated metal mixed with the colder tang of gunpowder as rifles discharged into the empty hallways, their echoes absorbed by walls that had known 1,000 secrets. Thorn moved closer to Silas's voice, each step deliberate, calm, precise. The protégé's confidence wavered now, his commands clipped and uncertain, betraying the tension of a man who had believed himself in control. Thorn's lips curved slightly in satisfaction. Chaos had a way of revealing character, stripping away bravado, exposing the raw edge of fear. And tonight, it was a tool he wielded with perfection. A faint hiss drew his attention to the far balcony, a gas line, long forgotten, slowly venting into the open air. He considered it, the potential for devastation tempered by precision. In a world of black and shadow, even the smallest element could alter the outcome, tip the scales in favor of the prepared, the patient, the predator who moved 3 steps ahead. The odds had shifted. The predictable choreography of death had been interrupted. And yet, in the presence of unpredictability, Thorn felt more alive than ever. He embraced it, letting the unknown guide him, sharpen him, elevate him above the men who had thought they could predict his every move. Anything could happen, yes. And in that knowledge, Thorn Radcliffe was untouchable. The air on the balcony was sharp, carrying the scent of rain and city lights far below. Thorn leaned against the cold steel railing, one hand pressed to the wound in his side, blood soaking the tailored fabric of his shirt. Pain was a language he had long ago learned to speak fluently, and tonight it was merely another note in the symphony of control. Below, the city sprawled like an indifferent audience, unaware of the violence and precision that had culminated here, at the edge of steel and shadow. Silas emerged from the doorway, rifle raised, boots clicking against the metal floor. He had been cautious, deliberate, calculated, trained to kill the man he had once called master. But the hesitation lingered, the fraction of doubt born from every fall, every trap, every whisper of chaos Thorn had orchestrated. Silas's eyes flicked to the wound, to the calm expression that refused to betray weakness, and for a moment, he faltered. "You don't have to do this," Silas said, voice tight, a mixture of defiance and recognition. "We can end this now." Thorn straightened, letting the pain anchor him rather than hinder him. His breath was steady, controlled, each exhale deliberate. "You think this is a choice," he said, voice low and measured, carrying the weight of decades and inevitability. "But the choice was made the moment you stepped into my world. Every lesson you ignored, every step you thought was your own, it led here." The wind tugged at Silas's coat, making him shift his stance. He was skilled, precise, faster than most, yet every movement Thorn had anticipated. The wound in his side throbbed with a sharp rhythm, but his focus did not waver. He had survived more than this, endured more than this, and he knew that fear was the greatest weapon a man could wield against himself. Silas's hesitation was his advantage, and he would exploit it fully. Another step forward, rifle trembling slightly, and Thorn advanced with slow, deliberate grace. Pain lanced through his side, but he let it sharpen him rather than slow him. Each word, each movement, each measured step became a lesson in dominance and inevitability. "You sought to kill me," he said quietly, "to prove something to yourself. But the question you never asked is, who truly commands the narrative?" Silas's eyes narrowed, the tension coiling in his shoulders, his gun wavering as the realization settled in. Thorn moved closer, close enough that the faint stench of blood and leather mingled with the metallic tang of the night air. He could see the subtle twitch of muscle, the way Silas's confidence unraveled under the weight of inevitability. The wind whipped harder, carrying the echo of the city below and the faint thrum of distant sirens. Thorn's wound bled, his body screamed, yet he remained the calm center in the storm, the predator who had turned his own cage into a throne. The final confrontation had arrived, not with fury, not with panic, but with the serene, unstoppable force of a man who had already won, not by surviving, but by defining the terms of his end. And in that quiet, jagged moment, it was clear, the master still controlled the board, even at the edge of everything. The city lights stretched endlessly below, indifferent to the violence that had unfolded in the penthouse above. Thorn stood on the balcony for a moment longer, blood soaking his shirt, breath ragged but measured, the wind tugging at his coat as if urging him to step fully into the night. Around him, the echoes of the battle lingered, soft groans, clattering metal, the faint hiss of smoke. But the chaos had slowed, the tempo of death and fear fading into the distance. Silas was on the floor, wounded, rifle discarded, and for the first time, the protégé truly understood the magnitude of the man he had tried to kill. There had been no triumph, only a lesson seared into memory. The predator had never been vulnerable, only patient. Thorn's eyes met Silas's, unflinching, calm, a mirror reflecting decades of experience and inevitability. "You wanted to take everything," Thorn said, voice low, steady, carrying the weight of consequence and understanding. "And yet, even now, you will not understand it fully. You can claim victory over the body, but the story is mine to control. A silence followed, thick and absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the city below and the soft, irregular drip of blood onto the balcony floor. Thorn swayed slightly, a reminder that he was still flesh, still mortal, still tethered to a world that could betray him in a heartbeat. And yet, in that swaying, that bleeding, there was a serenity no man could steal. He had reached the end of the line and realized the truth he had always known. Death could not touch a legend. He lowered himself onto the railing, letting gravity claim him slowly, deliberately, feeling the edges of the world sharpen in the last moments. His mind replayed decades of empire, of wars fought in alleys and boardrooms alike, of enemies fallen and allies betrayed. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry of inevitability, a life lived not just in power, but in understanding the true cost of it. Silas watched, eyes wide, body frozen by the enormity of what he had done, what he had witnessed. He had survived the night, but the man who had taught him everything, the Mafia boss, the predator, the ghost, was slipping into legend. Thorn's final act was not of violence, nor of survival, but of absolution. He had orchestrated his own myth, and now, whether he lived or died mattered little. The wind tore at the penthouse, carrying away the scent of blood, the whisper of gunfire, the echoes of betrayal. In the emptiness, in the vast expanse of sky and steel, only the story remained. Thorn Radcliffe, the name spoken in fear, respect, and awe, was no longer a man to be struck, challenged, or killed. He was something greater, an idea, a warning, a shadow that would linger long after the body was gone. And as the last light flickered across the balcony, Thorn allowed himself a faint smile, eyes closing to the city he had ruled, fought, and survived. Everything had happened. Nothing had been lost. And the legend endured.